Hi, everyone. My name is Betsy Cooper, and I am the director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all here today for this webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. This is an extremely important moment in our society, and we've seen a real groundswell of interest in anti-racism activities as a relationship of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we're particularly delighted to have in our webinar today two fellowship teams that will be presenting specifically on new ways to ensure equity in technology and policy. Just a few housekeeping notes. So first, our fellows will be presenting and releasing the amazing new products that they produced over the course of their Aspen Tech Policy Hub fellowships. They'll then be followed by our keynote speaker, Mutale Nkonde. And then we'll open it up to question and answer from the audience. So we really hope that this will be an opportunity for you all to participate as well. Feel free, if you have questions throughout the program, to put those questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And also keep an eye on the chat, because we'll be making sure to release the products that the fellows are actually opening up to the public today, so that you can check them out in real time while you're watching the webinar. And then finally, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Amy Wilson and her project on people-powered policy will be unable to join us today. She will be presenting at our next webinar on August 5th. So we hope that you'll join us for that one as well. So first and foremost, I'm extremely pleased to introduce Madison Jacobs and Nidhi Hebbar. Madison is a senior communications manager at the Public Rights Project, a big friend of the Hub. And Nidhi recently joined Google and works on misinformation and media literacy there. This dynamic duo focused on racial bias in EdTech, thinking about how procurement and helping schools make better decisions can change the world for the better. And so we're extremely excited to release the amazing products that they've produced, and I'm very happy to let them tell you all about it. So over to you, Madison and Nidhi. And Madison, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, sorry. Thank you so much, Betsy. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the webinar. We're super excited, Nidhi and myself, to present Edtech Equity and our work in mitigating racial bias in education technologies. So just to get started here, I think to set the tone for this presentation, it's really important to remember that nearly half of public school students in America are Black and Brown. And, they continue to live and face a much different educational experience than their white counterpart students in schools. And we all know it's no secret that systemic racism exists in schools. Not only does it exist in the way that curriculums are designed, in the way that teachers interact with students, but the biases live in really deep-rooted systemic structure of the public school system. This affects how students are perceived, and then in turn affects how they learn.
This type of racial bias gets recorded in what we then call objective outcome data. So for example, bias discipline policies are reflected in the fact that Black students get suspended at much higher rates than white students for the same behaviors. Or curriculum, as Madison mentioned, that's designed for white students results in lower grades and test scores for Black and Brown students compared to, for example, white or Asian, including Indian students. And as the rise of technology rises, or as the use of technology rises in schools, we see this type of data collected in different and new ways, in many different forms. So on the next slide, what we often see, for example, in a personalized learning app is that these technologies are continually assessing a student's understanding or a student's engagement without understanding the larger context around a student's experience. And so once companies collect enough of this type of data, they generally build algorithms on top of this data. With this type of approach, it's easy for companies to perpetuate existing racial bias and also introduce new types of bias into the technologies in a way that gets encoded so that it's very difficult for teachers and students to identify what might actually be happening. This might sound familiar, and it's because it's not specific to education.
And again, like Nidhi said, it's not specific to education. We've seen it happen across many other industries, and we know how ugly it gets. There's a few examples that you can see on the screen here. There's a lot of lessons that we've learned with the use of AI in these other industries, but there's really specific challenges that we face in education and education technology specifically. And so me and Nidhi really wanted to focus on specifically addressing these. But across all of these industries and all of the use of AI in these different contexts, one thing really holds true in many cases, and that's really the process in which these products are designed and developed, and the thought that goes into how that portion of, you know, creating these AI products and putting them inside of education technologies. It's really important that the design and development process bring racial equity into the purview as a part of the conversation.
Right, and so as Madison said, we hear a lot of conversation, especially in large tech companies, around product inclusion. We hear a lot of people talking about racial bias in technology, about racial bias in schools, but we very rarely hear people talk about racial bias in the technologies that's used in schools. And so that's what we wanted to focus on. We won't go into detail here. This is all in the toolkit that we will share with you later. But we wanted to point out here that there are many different entry points for bias, from ideation to implementation in the way that products are designed. And one of the most concerning is the last one, which is the lack of widespread testing for racial bias. So what that means is that companies rarely test for differences in effectiveness of their product by race, which means that it's very hard for companies to hold themselves accountable for whether or not their products are actually designed and work for all students. Now, as we dug deeper into this, we realized that one of the biggest challenges in this space is the lack of awareness across stakeholders. So we have tech companies, but we also have schools who act on behalf of students, and we have students and families themselves. What we really need to see is we need tech companies that deeply understand the experience that Black and Brown students have in public schools. We need schools to intimately understand the way that technologies are designed and developed so that they can champion the needs of their Black and Brown students. And we also need, most importantly, and probably hardest, we need to equip students and families with an understanding of the way that racial bias can come into play in the technologies that they use for learning, so that they can advocate for themselves when they experience discrimination. So we wanted to focus our solutions on this challenge. First, we built a practical toolkit for companies to understand what sort of things they can embed into each stage of development. So from ideation to implementation, there's a lot of different ways to make sure that you are uncovering and mitigating racial bias as it could enter into your process. We know that it's not going to be easy, but it will be worth it. And we hope that companies will embed these practices into their standard development process. We chose to build the toolkit in Coda so that companies can make a copy of it and interact with the tables we created and work through the activities with their team together. And then we structured the toolkit based on the standard processes of a development process. So ideation, you have testing and implementation, we have UX design, and you can very easily follow along. We also have additional appendices for definitions of AI and machine learning in the context of education technology for companies that may be less familiar with this process, or also not sure whether they want to incorporate machine learning into their products. And then we also have a product for schools that Madison will share.
Awesome, thank you so much, Nidhi. And as Nidhi mentioned, we wanted to take a multi-stakeholder approach to this issue. And school leaders really have a responsibility to their Black and Brown students to understand, have agency over understanding what is happening in the products that they're using and how they can bring the types of questions that they need to into the procurement process to make sure that they're keeping racial equity in the forefront as they're making decisions about the types of technology that they want to acquire. So we created this school procurement guide, and it's really a really powerful set of questions that they can ask tech companies to better understand whether these products were designed with students like Black and Brown in mind, and if tech companies really took the time to understand the racial equity lens in their development process. And we really hope to, make this conversation more accessible for schools and bring the power back to school leaders so that they can champion the needs of their students. And, you know, schools hold a lot of power in purchasing, especially the largest school districts in America, and really should be requiring equitable design, just like they require privacy and accessibility requirements in the tools that they use. So we're really excited about these two outputs. It was incredible working with Nidhi. And we're not done yet. There's a lot that still needs to be done. So we've had some really awesome trainings with several edtech companies, as well as advise schools on what to look for in the tech products that they're using currently, and also the tech products that they're looking to procure, and worked on sample RFP language and things like that. But it really doesn't stop here. There's two other entities that play a huge role in making this process successful in our public school system. And that's the voices of students, families, and the communities that they come from. They need to be more integrated into the process in which schools decide to use tech. More importantly, they need to be integrated into the design and development of the tech products. And we're encouraging education technology companies and technology company representatives that are on the call to think very deeply about the product inclusion practices that you have and how you are bringing, if you're designing for students, the students that are marginalized and underserved into the forefront, and bringing in their comments and their wants and needs into the way that you design and develop products. I think also, it's really important that policymakers understand that they play a role in this. From the legislative side, there are tons of policies that are already existing when it comes to data privacy, accessibility, and all of those types of things. We feel that the racial equity policies should be matching with those, and that all levels of government, whether that be state and local and federal, should be playing a role in creating the same type of standard that we have for the way that we currently regulate these technologies, and that technology, schools, and policymakers are really working in conjunction with communities and students and families to make the process really awesome, and to really have much more rigor in the way that we approach racial equity in schools outside of just culturally responsive teaching and things of that sort. Yeah, and so thank you so much for hearing our presentation today. It was so incredible to work with Nidhi on this project. A couple of ways that you can get in touch with us. We are on Twitter at Edtech Equity. We also have a website, edtechequity.org, where you can find all of our outputs, including some pretty in-depth policy briefs that we've written for education technology companies as well as schools. Very helpful also for policymakers to understand the issue at large and how they can play a role in making change. And yeah, Nidhi, I don't know if you have anything that you want to say to close it out, but appreciate so much for everyone being here.
Yeah, and I would just add to Madison's statement that if there are any schools listening and you want help to understand what you should be looking for, we would love to help you.
Thank you so much. Back to Betsy.
Thank you so much, Madison and Nidhi. It's been amazing to watch this project develop from an idea that you all had early in your fellowship to the tremendous impact we can see you're going to have now. And I just add that, you know, in light of this coronavirus pandemic that we're all experiencing, these tools are even more important, and the choices of what tools we use to educate our children will make a tremendous difference. So I'd urge everyone who's listening to this webinar to take the time to reach out to Madison and Nidhi and get involved in helping make sure that the products that we're using going forward to help especially do many of these online education processes actually reflect our society and are fair and equitable for all students. So next, I'd like to introduce Mariah Lichtenstern. She's the founding partner of Diversity Ventures and a managing director at the Founder Institute. Mariah's project focuses on enabling tech funding equity, providing new opportunities for disadvantaged founders to find new funding. We're very excited to release her products today, and she's here to tell you all about them. So over to you, Mariah.
Thanks so much, Betsy, and all who are watching today. I'm super excited to share this project with you. So the funding gap is a term that's used to describe the lack of equitable startup funding for underrepresented founders, specifically Black, Latinx, or female. 13% of the US population is Black and almost 17% is Latinx, yet less than 3% of venture-backed founders are from those ethnic groups. A full 82% of venture-backed founding teams are all male. So the policy problem I set out to solve is how might we close the early stage funding gap for underrepresented tech startup founders? Generally, we've heard that Silicon Valley, the epicenter of technology startups, is a meritocracy, and that a lack of diversity is a pipeline problem, but this is just not true. In deconstructing the pipeline myth in the case for more diverse fund managers, Kauffman Fellows found that neither education nor the number of underrepresented founders in the pipeline could explain how underfunded Black, Latinx, and female founders are. Furthermore, they found that ethnically diverse founding teams and leadership teams have higher realized returns on positive exits. And an often cited McKinsey analysis shows that companies in the top quartile of gender and ethnic diversity are more likely to outperform their counterparts. What's especially frustrating is that this persistent lack of funding to these underrepresented groups has a negative impact on our entire economy. The Center for Global Policy Solutions found that discriminatory finance practices that favor white male founders cost the US no less than 9 million jobs and $300 billion in annual national income. So how do we get to the root of this? Venture capitalists bear the brunt of media criticism for demonstrated inequities in tech funding, and it's understandable because the data is clear that bias exists. In one study, researchers found that VCs are more inclined to fund pitches when the presenter is male. Participants rated women as less persuasive, logical, and fact-based, even when they made identical pitches to their male counterparts. And this was also true of both male and female investors, which can be partially explained by the pressure that underrepresented investors feel to conform to the status quo so as not to rock the boat and be seen as a social justice warrior. Then there's homophily, a phenomenon in which humans network, socialize, co-invest, and partner with those most similar to them. The fact is, for a number of reasons, venture capitalists are overwhelmingly white and male. And a LinkedIn survey revealed that only 2% considered diversity a priority, which is why venture-backed founders are more of a meritocracy, with over a quarter of startup funding concentrated in Silicon Valley and more than half of VCs having a portfolio construction that's 25 to 50% Ivy League founders. Not only do venture capitalists tend to network and invest in those most like them, they also exclude those who aren't. And this is reflected in the underrepresentation of Black, Latinx, and female investors too in the hiring process. And while it's true that these issues are problematic, the funding gap starts much earlier than venture capital. Of the $500 billion a year that goes to startups, 60% is founders' own resources, known as bootstrapping. 38% comes from the friends and family round. Less than 2% of startup capital comes from angel or VC funding. And herein lies the problem. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, regulates how founders raise capital, including whom they raise from, how, and how much they can raise. All of the regulations you see here have one rule that's a common thread. That rule is Rule 501, defined under Regulation D. This rule defines what constitutes an accredited investor. To be considered accredited, investors must meet established thresholds for income and or net worth. And through this definition, both founders and funders face separate and unequal access to startup offerings and investment opportunities. Less than 15% of Americans meet the criteria for accredited investors. And of that, less than 5% are Black or Latinx, 22% are female. Why? Because mostly the wealth gap. The average white household has 7 times the wealth of the average Black household and 5 times the average Latinx household. And when we look at the median wealth, the gap is even wider. So the mission of the SEC is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. But barring investors based on income and net worth defies those goals. To understand the significance of this rule, one has to look beneath the surface to the history of the SEC and other federal agencies formed during the Great Depression, also a time of racial unrest, and when Black Wall Streets across the nation were being destroyed by race riots. While the Federal Housing Administration and Homeowners Loan Corporation explicitly excluded Black Americans from creating wealth in real estate through a process known as redlining, the SEC was more covert, using the accredited investor definition as a dog whistle term to veil economic exclusion. So while income inequality makes it hard for most founders to raise capital, the wealth gap makes it especially hard for underrepresented founders to bootstrap and to raise capital from their own communities, even those with financial resources and the risk tolerance to invest. The SEC calls this rule a form of investor protection, but it only applies to private markets, not to public markets. All investments entail risk. The liquidity of public markets also contributes to its volatility. People buy and sell according to various strategies, advice, and even headlines. Non-accredited investors lose life savings on consumer apps. And let us not forget that the most devastating losses to our economy have been in the public markets. That is, after all, what the SEC was formed to guard against. In the private market, most startups fail or deliver a modest return, but the reason why limited partners entrust venture capitalists to deploy tens of billions of dollars each year is because it only takes one major win to make up for a multitude of losses and return a multiple on a fund. Investors buy startups for pennies per share at the earliest rounds. Imagine if, instead of being limited to crowdfunding offerings, Americans were free to invest and to diversify their risk by investing in venture capital funds. These opportunities are extremely limited under the current rules. I don't know if anybody else has pooled money in a church building fund or other philanthropic projects, but how is it that we have financial autonomy on spending, but not investing? Even if we were to give the SEC the benefit of the doubt and assume that the accredited investor rule is truly intended to protect investors from loss, is paternalism the best policy? Restricting Americans from investment opportunities does not protect them from losing money elsewhere. It just ensures that they don't have equal access to some of the most lucrative investment opportunities. With these facts in mind, this project proposes two solutions to closing the funding gap. The SEC has published a concept release requesting comments on proposed changes to the accredited investor definition. You'll find a policy brief on the topic on the Aspen Tech Policy Hub website. I'm also publishing a petition to be delivered by email to the SEC along with a public comment. The second solution is the Opportunity Pledge, Accelerating Equity and Startup Opportunities, which aims to engage private equity investors to increase investments to underrepresented founders and fund managers 10x by 2025. This pledge includes a framework to facilitate greater access to diverse deal flow, empowers underrepresented fund managers to establish investment track records, and increases access to investor networks for underrepresented founders. These solutions are hosted on our techfundingequity.com website, where stakeholder engagement and continuing advocacy can take place. So the homepage contains quick links to each project. Viewers can read the policy brief and also sign the petition. They can enroll in the Opportunity Pledge, and there's quick links to infographics summarizing solutions and actions that stakeholders can take. Here you can see a dedicated page for the SEC rule and the actions that you can take for that solution. And the Opportunity Pledge page, it summarizes the purpose and framework with access to the pledge itself. And the ability to enroll. Once stakeholders enroll in the Opportunity Pledge, they'll be sent a link where they can download not only the white paper with the framework, but also their certificate of participation and other resources. And all stakeholders can subscribe to the newsletter for updates. We invite you to participate as we engage in partnerships and coalition building to close the tech funding gap. Please subscribe, follow us on social, and visit our website. And in closing, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible support that went into this project from the team at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub and Aspen Digital. I'd also like to send a special thanks to Dan Porterfield, who joined us for dinner in January and imparted how racism and inequality are two of the most important issues we must address in the world today. I also want to thank my project mentor, Chris Russell, startup advisor and investor Cheryl Beninga, Matthew Friedman of the Mekong Club, Frank Casey of Casey Moats, Jonathan Greachin and Adea Racy of the Founder Institute, Cameron Law of the Carlson Center for Entrepreneurship at CSUS, and many more who supported this project. Back to you, Betsy.
Thanks so much, Mariah. I think we can all understand how important it is to have a more diverse group of folks developing new products, and how difficult it is, especially in this current environment, for people to get funding. So we're really, really pleased to release these products today. I hope you'll take a look. If you see the chat, you can click on the products right now and take the pledge, sign the petition, and really use this as an opportunity to get involved on these important issues. So thanks again, Mariah. If you have any questions for Madison, Nidhi, Mariah, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. After our keynote speaker, we will get to questions, and we love getting all sorts of questions from the audience. So please share lots of ideas so we have a great discussion afterwards. But first, I want to introduce our fabulous keynote, Mutale Nkonde. She's an AI policy analyst and researcher based in New York City, and she's the founder of AI for the People. So she's the perfect person to put the fellows' projects into context and to tell us why they matter precisely for this moment. And so we're extremely excited to have her join us here today on our Aspen Tech Policy Hub stage. So over to you, Mutale.
Thank you so much, Betsy, and congratulations to all the fellows. I definitely feel that I was in community with you as you rolled out your projects. So for the next couple of minutes, I just want to really share with you where I think all your work sits, and certainly in conversation with mine. So I would be what's now considered a public interest technologist, but when I started out in 2012, I was just the noisy person sitting in meetings when working with nonprofits and companies like Google. We were working on a project between them and Black Girls Code, and really, really pointing out the ways in which technology was impacted by what I call anti-Black racism. And I would argue that the projects that we talked about and the work that I do sits in this realm of digital civil society. Digital civil society is a term that was coined by Lucy Bernholtz, who I've been working with over at Stanford this year in the Digital Civil Society Lab. And it has three basic concepts that I would want to discuss with you all today and then later in discussion. So the first thing that we all do is that we're centering technical processes in our work. So whether it's we're helping schools procure, and we're really helping them understand how their data becomes encoded with bias, as I've been doing actually prior to this meeting. I'm on the East Coast. So I was speaking to a group of CS teachers and administrators at the New York City Department of Education. It's the largest school district in the world, 1.1 million students, and 70% of those students are Black, brown, and low income. So we were definitely having a conversation about how to raise awareness of those issues, because much of their lives are mediated by the algorithms that we discussed. The second element of digital civil society, as laid out by Lucy and folks at Stanford, is this idea that we're looking at how technology impacts society. So I am definitely somebody that has worked in technology for at least half of my professional career, but in that time, I've always been really interested in not necessarily what the algorithm could do or what the system could do, but what happens when we're using it time, and what happens if you're from a minoritized group who's also traditionally disadvantaged. The third part of that is really bringing new people into the conversation. And that's something that I think all of the groups have done really beautifully. In AI for the People, which is a nonprofit that I started to house my work back in October of last year, we think about three things as our theory for change. We think about the story, because we really, we work opposite filmmakers, journalists, and other cultural creators to communicate with them about technology, and how do we change these stories about tech neutrality and think about a new type of way of moving forward, where we're all included and where we acknowledge that our technologies reflect our society, they don't make it anew. The second thing we think about are roles. I have a policy background. I was part of the team that introduced the Algorithmic Accountability Act that looked into impact assessments. We also looked at deep fakes and information integrity and the role that platforms play in dis and misinformation. And we also looked at biometrics, so how facial recognition specifically, but also interested in gait recognition, voice recognition, and others. And in that role, I was really looking at the legal policies and practices that have delivered us the Silicon Valley that we have. So everything from Section 230 in terms of what can be on platforms, through to should we be thinking about ourselves as users, or should we be thinking about ourselves as consumers, and should technological processes be considered public works and public utilities and therefore regulated in that way. The third thing that AI for the People think about a lot is the money. So if we can change stories about tech neutrality, if we can change rules to make sure that more people can participate, where does that funding come from? And we're in really big conversations with people with high net worth who are interested in racial justice, as well as the foundation community, to make sure that projects and minoritized founders are going to be the beneficiaries as we start to really think about, do Black Lives Matter in this moment? So it is such a pleasure to not only see your projects, but also situate ourselves in this deeper field that Bernholtz and others at Stanford are thinking about as digital civil society. So I think that the next best thing that somebody from an organization like mine that really looks at story is to present one that really illustrates this idea that I'm putting forth. So on May 25th, an African-American man called George Floyd goes into a store called Cup Foods in Minneapolis. The allegation made against him is that he passed a $20 bill and it was a counterfeit. And we don't actually know if that's true, but there's a local ordinance, again, thinking about rules within Minneapolis that says if a store owner receives a counterfeit, they have to call the police. And that's what was done. 8 minutes and 46 seconds after being accosted by the police and air supply being cut off, George Floyd had died. You'll notice that even as I'm presenting this story, I'm not presenting those images of his death, because I also think that platform companies and those of us that tell the stories of tech have to maintain the dignity of each person. And we would never expect to see the execution video of Daniel Pearl, because that was a travesty against humanity. And I would express to folks in the tech community to really think about, even in the context of 230, whether we should be subjected to the death and re-death which traumatizes those of us racialized as Black, of George Floyd. So his story was really interesting because he was out of work at the time that he was going to Cup Foods. And the reason he was out of work is that he worked in the hospitality industry. And therefore, because of shelter-in-place protocols, couldn't go, but also had to work in that sector because he had prior felonies and was finding it difficult to find white-collar work. Immediately, the story was put online. And that is when digital civil society really took hold. Americans, Black, white, rich and poor, Asian, and all other stripes took to the streets saying Black Lives Matter, which started as a hashtag in the wake of the death of Trayvon Martin, a young African-American boy who was lynched by his neighbor, George Zimmerman, back in 2012. Because we have disinformation that travels on our networks, right-wing groups like the Boogaloo Nation, which has now been banned, so thank you to all the platforms that did that, also saw this mass protest and decided to align with Black Lives Matter. But what they're actually looking for in their ideology is to incite a racial civil war that would split our country apart. The police were one of the folks in the middle of this. There was violent protest as well as nonviolent protest, and there were responses around the country that varied. But this is just an example of some of the pictures we were seeing back then, and unfortunately we're seeing in Portland now. The call for this led to a hashtag, which was Black Lives Matter, leading to a policy call. So going back to that framework that I offered of story, rule, and money, the story was around racial inequality that was driven through social networks. The rules are that anything can appear on our social networks because of 230 and other rules that I think folks like myself are really beginning to wonder if we should reimagine. And the streets rose, and we decided that we wanted to change other rules, and those were around how and why we are policed. Because in policing of Black and brown bodies in the United States, there is also a conversation about technology, but specifically biometrics. So in the call to defund the police, IBM, who are not a big player in the facial recognition field, nor should I also caution our Amazon and Microsoft, who also joined this, but a group of tech companies wrote to the Congressional Black Caucus and pointed out how facial recognition technology was being used in policing. And in line with the new values that they were taking on as companies would not sell to police forces, Amazon being the only company that spoke about a moratorium. But what wasn't included in that were the facial recognition units that are being sold to ICE, Border Control, and the FBI, and were not referenced, or the fact that these larger companies are really not the biggest player in those fields. But what it did do from those of us that sit in digital civil society, which is also a subset of public interest technology, was to see a crack in the door, really, where we could potentially change some of the larger rules. And so what ended up happening with that are a draft of bills that came forward where facial recognition for the first time was linked with policing. Black Lives Matter is not just a hashtag, it's a movement. It's the way that I hope that we will move forward. And the New York Times did an investigation where they used geolocation data to figure out where and when people were protesting using that hashtag. And they came back with this preliminary idea that Black Lives Matter is potentially the largest social movement of our time. And I think as we're mourning John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and other civil rights leaders, that we really should take a moment to thank them for the foregrounding of this and the work that they have done, and see ourselves as a generation that could continue this work, which I argue will never ever be completed, but we're certainly further along. In the New York Times investigation, they pinpointed June 6th as the peak of Black Lives Matter activism. On that day, 500 million Americans in 50,000 different places tweeted out or updated the hashtag Black Lives Matter and referred to themselves as being at a protest. So as I start to close out and hope that other people will join me in the conversation, I want us to think about how members of digital civil society, how can we not have edtech projects and programs that use racial equity as the lens by which we serve a diverse student body? How can we not fund founders, whether they're on the private side or even whether they're on the public side like myself, to do this critical work that helps us understand not only who we are as Americans now, but who we could be as Americans in the future? Because in my view, all policy is tech policy because of the way in which algorithmic decision-making systems impact every area of our life. And before I close out, I just want to say congratulations again, and thank you for the Aspen Tech Institute for inviting me to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mutale. It is just wonderful to hear your inspirational words, and we're looking forward to a conversation now, bringing together all these threads. So let's bring back our fellows as panelists, and we'll start off with the Q&A. So just a reminder, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can over the next 15 or so minutes. First, I'd like to ask a question to our keynote, Mutale. You illustrated in your presentation the momentous power that the digital civil society has wielded in this particular political and cultural moment. What do you imagine the future of the digital civil society to be? And what can we do as policymakers, as technologists, as citizens to work together to ensure that it's a hopeful one?
So first of all, I'd really like to congratulate you, Betsy, for creating a space where people who are thinking about these issues can congregate, because I think one of the first things we need to do is to have a fair and equal exchange of ideas. And for institutions like Aspen and others to really allow us and empower us to really leverage their brands and their market power makes these conversations even more viable. I also think that, going back to the story role money framework that I offered, we really do need to keep pressing the story that technology is not neutral, that tech products are political in nature, and how and why they're designed should be interrogated as seriously as the innovation itself. We need to move away from the idea that, you know, an app can fix it, because it cannot. I cringe every time I hear the words problem statement, and then somebody tells me that an app is going to fix racism, sexism, ableism, or any of these other forces in our society, which are really about the balance of power. The next thing I would say in terms of rules, and I think that Madeline did this so beautifully in her presentation, is interrogate the rules that we have, the history of when they were made, and then look at them from a racial justice and racial equity lens, and decide whether they fit the society that we're in. And then lastly, we are a capitalist money. Show us the money. The money has to flow equally to all that show potential. I recently, as last week, became an American citizen, and one of the things that I was asked during my oath ceremony was, will you do work that pushes our nation forward? And I was so proud, through the work that I've done and the partnerships that I've been part of, to say, yes, we are part of reimagining America, and we need to engage our most I would say optimistic imagination to really think about what we can see. And if you don't have that, then please just do read Octavia Butler and other works of Afrofuturism that really lay out a future in which all of us can revel in the power of technology for good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So now I want to turn to Nidhi and Madison. So first, how will we know when we've achieved racial equity? An anonymous attendee asks. What specific metrics are you looking to use to track success?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think this is one that's posed a lot in this space, and we think that it's detrimental to expect that in order to act or change, we have to be able to achieve racial equity, sort of to Mutale's point. You know, there's centuries of systemic racism to contend with in education. But we worked very closely with Matt Vogt and Liz Allendorf, who helped us understand what we can measure is racial inequity, so that we know where to change. We can measure our impact on racial equity with the technologies we build. And the easiest way to do that is to explicitly measure differences in our products and their effectiveness for students across different races. So if your product is less effective for Black and Brown students compared to white or Asian students, then you know. We would like to see more companies that can speak to the testing and evaluation that they've done to understand their impacts. And we know that most companies don't want to collect sensitive data on race and ethnicity, but there are many ways around it. For example, Dr. Ryan Baker's lab has found that you can use the demographics in aggregate of a school and test across multiple schools to get pretty close to that. evaluation.
Great, and another question for Nidhi and Madison. Do you find school districts have the tech muscle to both understand and use information like this? Or will this be more of a push system where industry is getting the school systems to understand why this is important? How are you seeing that right now?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Thank you so much for the question. So I think it's sort of a mixture of both. There are some school districts that do have the tech muscle as well as the procurement entities to have a deeper conversation about what we presented. And there are some school districts that don't, and their understanding is going to be at a very sort of beginner level, especially when it comes to not just procuring tech, but understanding what is underneath the hood when it comes to the way that tech is used in schools, as well as how AI might find itself being used in the tech, and how the data that's being fed into the tech may be exacerbating current issues that already exist in the schools. But in the conversations that we've been having with school districts, we do see that this is something that people, I hate to say this, but are starting to think about. This is something that we should have been thinking about for hundreds of years, since the dawn of time. But as you know, past presenters so beautifully put it, we are amongst a very specific movement. A lot of people have a lot of questions about how racial inequities enter all layers of a system, including the educational system. What we have seen also in the past is that schools really did beef up their technology expertise when it came to ensuring student data privacy, when it came to ensuring accessibility. And this actually happened largely because they were met with this call through regulation. It was like, well, because this was legislated and then regulated, we have to make sure that student data is private. We need the same rigor for racial equity in the way that products are designed and developed, and bringing that type of awareness to the schools helps them have the agency to ask the right questions, so that tech companies design and develop differently. But it also creates a system in which, like, the resounding of the community and the resounding of the voices that are using the technology drive for change in policy and regulation that require this to be a more standard way that we see how we design and develop tech in education.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So next I want to turn to Mariah. First, your project suggests a really simple and elegant solution for combating startup redlining, a policy shift at the SEC that could lead to more equitable investment standards. So the questioner asks, could you tell us more about how the Opportunity Pledge builds on this policy step, and how it would help ensure more representative investors in startups?
Thanks for the question. So I think one of the challenges that we see in the problem of tech funding equity is that there's an assumption that we can't walk and chew gum. For example, when you say diversity in Silicon Valley, the priority has been on gender diversity. And the assumption has been that we can't do things in parallel, but we can. So in addition to getting to the root of the problem, which starts before founders even get to the VC stage, we can work with the founders and the underrepresented fund managers that are already in the pipeline, but because of heuristics that have kept them out, they've not been able to progress equitably. So the Opportunity Pledge is designed to benefit both emerging managers and existing managers by not only, having a pledge that that private equity investors, limited partners, and venture capitalists can commit to, but also a framework that guides them on carrying that out and provides a community of support. Because this is not about naming and shaming and blaming. This is about, okay, we see that this is the time to change. It's long overdue. How do we work together to make sure that this happens and that we don't backslide like we've done so many times before into complacency? And so it's really designed to work with the people that are already in the pipeline, and to make sure that there's an ongoing process of commitment to tech funding equity.
Fantastic, thank you. And another question for you from Adele Burns. Have you thought about the intersection of the early stage self-funding and friends and family rounds with the evolving conversation around reparations? Perhaps there is a policy movement at the state, federal levels around that kind of funding. What do you think?
I think, that question it kind of caught me off guard, but you know what it reminded me of, Betsy, was the project that that you opened the door for us to do on day one. And so my project was around a social equity fund, a social wealth fund for our nation. So something like a sovereign wealth fund, but a social wealth fund whereby our nation could invest, and we've seen trillions put into the pandemic response, but we could invest in a fund that that invests back into the startup community and the technologies that keep our nation secure, help to develop technologies that have things like, you know, what other participants have presented in mind, cybersecurity, et cetera. And we could have the returns from that go back into the social wealth fund and help to fund reparations, a basic income, to where we're not always going into debt to fund things like our pandemic response. We have a reserve that is created through the wealth that we generate as citizens, and that we should all be invested in as stakeholders and shareholders in our country. So yes, I think the reparation discussion is long overdue. I think the question is, how do we do it? And we've really not committed enough discussion to that. But I do think that there is an intersection in tech and reparations. So I'm happy to explore that further.
Awesome. And if you're not familiar with the Day One project, it's a project ongoing to pull together 100 new ideas for tech policy in the next administration, regardless of political position. So really cool opportunity, and a little hint that several of our fellows may or may not be working on things that will come out through that project. So we're excited to see even more policy ideas be growing in this space. The next question is again for Mutale. What are strategies that you use to get the attention of corporations with your efforts against racial bias in tech policy? This is a question by RG. So Mutale, what do you think?
So I've used really thought leadership as a way of getting attention. Last year, I published a report called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech, which was an ethnography where we spoke to 30 participants, and it was VPs of engineering or above in tech companies, as well as people that held diversity and equity type roles at the VP level. And all we asked is that they reported to a C-suite person. And we found two really interesting things. Diversity, equity, and inclusion people don't often report to the C-suite. So that told us a lot about where they're positioned within the company. But beyond that, we found that even speaking about race was really difficult, that the idea of diversity was one that was really about cis, white, able-bodied women and really nobody else. And we, through that project, developed a framework called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech, which had three basic ways of thinking about how to talk about race within your product team. And it was looking at the history. So Mariah did a beautiful example of that when she spoke about redlining and the development of the SEC. And then once you have a cognitive awareness of how race has already embedded whatever you're speaking about, really speaking about the emotions of race. People are incredibly uncomfortable to talk about this force that really disappears some of us and elevates others of us in a way that is unfortunate. And how can we develop a culture within our team where we can think about not race being interpersonal, but structural, and how we have developed policies and practices that uphold some groups and downgrade others. And then third, an action plan. And that has been so successful. That has definitely, just that report alone has taken me all over the world, has taken me into companies outside of tech, because we keep speaking about Silicon Valley, but if we think about health companies, education companies, I've done some work with the banking sector. All of these people are using technology, and they want to use it in a way that, even from a PR perspective, isn't going to get them some of the headlines that we see with larger platform companies. And then from that, did some writing with the Harvard Business Review that looked specifically on how companies can use their social responsibility and human rights departments to think about how they're using algorithms and the algorithms that they use. And then just released a report with Harvard African American Policy Review around a concept called automated anti-Blackness, where I'm actually asking people to move away from the use of the term bias and really frame the way in which Black users are disadvantaged through this new frame, and take advantage of the moment that we're in. And I will be writing about that. That will become a book that will be out in the next year. So I have found that has been so successful. And the work I've done at Harvard and Stanford and other places, those have been intellectual homes where I've got the credibility to get through the door in the beginning.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that overview, and I hope some of you are inspired to try to follow a similar path. So I want to do a quick lightning round before we wrap. So what is your bumper sticker for this conversation? So if you had one sentence that you want people to understand and get across from what you've experienced here, what would be that bumper sticker? So Madison, I'm going to start with you.
Black Lives Matter. That's my bumper sticker.
Awesome. Nidhi, what about you?
I'd say test for racial equity.
Fabulous. Mariah, what about you?
Stop startup redlining.
Stop startup redlining. And finally, Mutale, what's your bumper sticker?
Tech is not neutral.
Fantastic. And I'd like to give our panelists all credit. You're the first ones that actually did bumper stickers when I asked this question in our webinars. So first, I want to thank our fellows. Congratulations, Mariah, Nidhi, Madison. You've done wonderful work at the Hub, and we're so excited to finally be able to share your products with the world. Mutale, thank you so much for joining us. We are honored to have you as a keynote. I'd also like to thank Sevilla, Maddie, Javier, Karner, and the entire Aspen support team for helping make this webinar run so smoothly. Our next webinar is on August 5th, and it features improving democracy through technology. And I'm thrilled to announce that California Supreme Court Justice Tino Cuellar will be our keynote speaker. So that's an amazing opportunity. Matthew Volk and Elizabeth Allendorf will be presenting on misinformation in elections. Jessica Cole will be presenting on the use of automated advocates to help our justice system. And then Amy Wilson, who is unable to join us today, will also be doing her presentation on people-powered policy in Oakland. So we remind you to check out our website at aspentechpolicyhub.org to see all the amazing products that we've released today. We want to thank you again for joining us and hope to see you again on August 5th. Congratulations to the fellows, and thanks again on behalf of the entire Hub team. Have a great afternoon.